Good afternoon, my beautiful people. I go by the name Shotade Olusegun. In today's live session, we're going to actually continue with, we're going to continue from where we stopped in the previous, from the previous upload rather. So now the title of this particular live session is, the true nature of time, light, and mass as revealed by formula of everything. And this is going to be the part 3. Now I have to do this part 3 because the part 2 I did was so short. I don't know why. You understand? So something happened, technical issue. So now I have to do this part 3. Now this part 3 is going to be quite insightful and informative. So I'm going to actually, wrap it up, and then you will get the detailed information about, what the true nature of time is, light and mass, and even get to know what the true nature of the fabric of the universe is. So now, in the previous upload rather, so I define what energy is. You can, have the definition right up here. And so the only way we could quantify, you know, energy is just to have this visual illustration of electromagnetic wave. And then we have the illustrative diagram of mass to be what we have right here. As you can see, we have strands of spiral formation. The outermost layer is where we have mass density in blue color. The red spiral formation right inside that, represents energy density. So then the for what is it called, the definition of mass is what we have to be this, and then we have definition of time to be the electromagnetic speed of relativity scaling. I know you are not so conversant with this definition. Of course, the other two definitions I got them from my dictionary, but no one can no one can actually, define what time is. But based on my novel research discovery, I was able to actually give you an ideal definition of time. And as I progress, with this live session, you get to understand why it is that definition. So now, what this diagram that I have here is known as, time energy wave model. This is the visual illustration of what you're going to get when you apply formula of everything. Don't forget, I told you that formula of everything is dt dm, and that dt dm represents the curvature of time, which is what we have in this blue. So now it is what we have as, this blue trajectory, and energy, the m dt the m, stands for the curvature of energy, and that is what we have as, this red trajectory. So now the TDM equal to capital UM plus 4M. That is the old formula of everything. So the capital UM plus 4M is a nested linear solution right inside the, curvature. And when you apply it, we're going to have equilateral triangle being nested right inside the curvature. And then at the present phase, or at event horizon, we have that equilateral triangle being flipped, and that represents, the phenomenon that we might have right inside the black hole, any black hole. So the initial equilateral triangle represents the expanding cosmological space. The vertical trajectory, that is the instant trajectory of time, and that is the, we can as well liken it to be event horizon, or we can call it the present phase of time peregrination. While the initial equilateral triangle, we can call it the past phase of time peregrination, and the flipped equilateral triangle, we can call it to be the future phase of time peregrination or black hole. And why that past, like I said, we represent the cosmological expanding phase of the universe. So now, basically, I'm not going to, really waste time on this time energy wave model. I will get back to it. But right now, I want you to have a clear picture of what kind of relationship we are likely to have when we're trying to consider the kind of relationship that is inherent between distance and time. Now, I want you, let me take this to this side. There is this particular experiment performed by Galileo. So he had this ramp, and then he placed a ball right at the topmost edge. But then the ramp has this measurement right on it. Now, the way this measurement is configured is that Galileo initiated an arbitrary measure, and that is actually tagged to a that is actually tagged to, or rather, let me say it was tagged to 1 unit of time measure. So you have 1 unit measure of arbitrary measure called Galileo, and that is tagged to 1 unit measure of time. So now, please, I need you to pay rapt attention to this. So if you have the ball to move right from the initial measure to where we have 1, that is known as Galileo, 1 Galileo, and it is the same thing as 1 unit of time. But then, if you now try to use the 2 units of time to measure the distance that that ball will travel, instead of having the ball to travel right from the initial point to the point where we have at the back of the 1 measure, you have it to move right from the initial point to the point where we have 4. And then Galileo tried to use 3 units of time, and then he placed the ball at the initial measure. Instead for Galileo to have that measure to be at the point, to be at the mark that we have before that 4 mark, as we have it right here, the mark where 4 is written on top. Instead for us to have that measure, to have it right at that mark before the 4 point, Galileo realized that the measure was actually at the point where we have the 9 mark. So now, if we're to dissect that relationship, we see that 1 Galileo is the same thing as 1 square in the measure of time. 2 Galileo is the same thing as 2 squared in time measure. 3 Galileo is the same thing as 3 squared. Now, by having these to be in exponential form, it simply means that time is not linear. The trajectory of time is not linear relative, to the distance. The measure of time is in form of curvature, because once you have it to be in power of 2, you know that it's going to incur curvature. So basically, with that, we can get to know how time relates with distance, or probably let us say the time it takes for objects to travel from one point to another. So basically, if we're to try to get the fact, to get what is actually happening, we can say that multiple of the time that it takes for object to travel from one point to another is what is being measured by time. And if we're to liken that to the measurement of light, we can then see why it is only ideal for light to be measured in two-way measurement. So the two-way measurement is having a clock at initial point, then have a reflector at the extreme other side, such that once you eject light beam, then the light beam will reflect on that mirror or whatever it is that you place at the extreme end that light could reflect on, and then the light will travel back to the initial point where you have the clock. And once it hits the detector, then we can actually read the time, and whatever value you get when you divide that by 2 will be the average measure of time, light rather. So that average measure of light is what we measure as the speed of light. But then Leibniz said that there is this inherent force, you understand, with every object, and for you to interpret that inherent force, then you have to consider the square of any speed. You have to consider the square of object speed. So now, photon, that is the particle that actually that mediates light speed. And so we can say light speed must as well have its speed being squared. Because the reason we have this to be so is for the fact that no point can actually exist in the universe without having an inverse of it at other side. What do I mean by that? When you have a point, without it being inversely related to another point in the universe, that point is non-existent. That point is non-existent because there is no way you can describe that point. There is no way you can define that point. But you can define that point if it is and only if that point is related inversely to another point. Then you can say the initial point, while the other can be referred to as a later point, or you call that initial point the past point, while the later point can be referred to as the future point. So now, what we have in between the 2 points will then be known, or rather, let's say the connection we're going to have is what is known as relativity. Relativity will initiate its own central point such that the 2 points, when they are approaching each other, they will approach at equal speed, and when they are moving away from each other, they will move away at equal speed. And that is why before the light measure, or before we can actually measure light, we must have a multiple of light speed that are being inversely related to each other. That is the idea. But then let's look at how time, works with light. So if we say it is not possible for us to have that average measurement of light speed in the universe. So if we now conclude that the only way light can even be instantiated at its own speed is to have multiple of its average speed, then we can get to know that there is possibility for us to have this circular momentum. So how is it likely for us to have that circular momentum? It is likely to have that circular momentum when you consider the fact that the square of the light speed is without compression. So it's more or less like the effect of time on the light speed is contracting the speed of light. That additional speed, it's contracting it, and it is by contracting it that we now have that curvature. It is that curvature that we actually allow for constantly accelerated momentum. Don't forget that the light speed is constant. And since the multiple of light speed within the envelope of time will still ensure that constancy, so we're going to have constantly accelerated momentum. Then the additional energy that is being introduced will be compacted. It will be absorbed and then will be compacted. And based on that, we could have this repulsive force because the gravitational side of the time peregrination will be inversely related to the mass decaying virtue of light speed, and the point where we're going to have that to be equal to each other, we're going to have standing wave. So now I'm going to use this diagram to briefly explain what I'm trying to say. Now when we look at this diagram, we have the curvature of time trajectory to be this blue curvature, while the curvature of energy is this red curvature as we have it. But then when we apply formula of everything, so we can actually substitute to apply formula of everything. Take for instance, if we should substitute the mass worth of electron in the place of the 2m's of that formula, what we're going to get is going to be this classical value, and it's going to be the counterpart of that quantum mass worth, and that is 2,277,250,000 kilograms. But then if we then put this classical mass worth and substitute that in the place of the 2m's in that formula of everything, the answer that we're going to get is going to be this, which is 5.7 times 10 raised to power 48. Now, we know this trajectory is at classical level because there is no negative sign to that power as we have it. But then we can get to know that this trajectory is diagonal when we'll expand this in standard form. We will then see the worth of that 4m. Don't forget that we have the linear solution of the formula of everything to be capital Um plus 4m. The 4m is the weak conveying force. I call it weak conveying force. The capital that is the strong conveying force. So the capital U is the constant speed of the universe, which is 2.5 times 10 raised to power 39. That is the constant speed of the universe. So now, the worth of that 4m will be suspended at 30 seconds. And that is why we could have this 5.7 times 10 raised to power 32 right here. And so the convergence is going to be this big spiral formation. Don't forget that the spiral is actually, moving towards the center of this curvature as we have it. Now, what we have here is known as classical arbitrary suspension. But then we know that it will have to travel at 45 angle degree But then that is the action of time. Action of time must have a reaction in form of energy, and it has to be equal. And don't forget, this can be likened to having multiple of light speed, as I said the other time, before we could, have the feasibility of light measure. You understand? And so, by having the inverse reaction of energy, then we're going to have this other diagonal trajectory. And when you look at its number, it is 5.7 times 10 raised to power minus 32, which is the same thing as what we have right here. And then the curvature of the energy to the curvature of time, we have to be the same thing, which is 5.7 times 10 raised to power minus 48, as we have right here. But then this baseline trajectory, the vertical trajectory, how are we going to get it to close these two inversely related trajectory of energy to time, so as to have our complete equilateral triangle? Then we realize that the best thing to do is to manually annihilate the suspended zeros. Don't forget that we have this couple of zeros to suspend the worth of that weak conveying force. And then this is going to be spontaneous, but in our case, because we're using mathematics, we need to manually annihilate the suspended zeros. So it will be spontaneous because what we have right from this classical convergence, which is the classical arbitrary suspension, down to this quantum arbitrary suspension, what we have there is what is known as free fall, and that is the classical gravity for you. So we have free fall. Then how is it possible for us to have free fall here? And by the nature of free fall, it means that the weight has no effect, because when you are falling at a certain height, you will not experience your weight, and then you will fall by the virtue of gravity. So now, then, for us to move right from where we have that suspension through the suspended zeros, there is not going to be any effect of mass worth. And so that is the reason we're going to only annihilate the suspended zeros. So now to annihilate, don't forget that what we have that is being suspended is the base value of electrons worth, which is 9.109. That base value is not 9.10, it is 9,109, as we have it right here. And that is another indication that what we have there is at the suspension as we have it is at classical level. Now, for us to annihilate that, we will put that 9,109, we put it over 10 raised to power 32. And then we'll expand that fraction to have it to be 9.109 times 1 all over 10 raised to power 32. Having that like that, we know that when we solve that further, what we're going to have will now be 9.109 times 10 raised to power minus 32. Now, what we have is smaller compared to the initial value of electron, and that is an indication that this vertical trajectory has shifted into the black hole, and so we now have decay effect or decaying effect on it. So it has been decayed to that value that we have. But then I'm still going to show you one powerful diagram that we drill deep into the structure of equilateral triangle for you to know the inherent or the hidden feature of the equilateral triangle, even though the equilateral triangle is equal at all sides. So now let's progress. Now, what that is telling us is that it is only feasible for us to travel this vertical trajectory one time. Even though we can apply this trajectory forward and back. We can travel through this trajectory forward and backward. But then it is only possible for us to apply this trajectory one time if we're to get the exact position of quantum particle relative to the exact position of classical mass worth. That is what that is telling us. So now what we now have is that it has been shifted because we use the quantum mass worth to get the classical mass worth, which is this. So that is the first trick. Now by using this classical mass worth to reconfirm the quantum mass worth, then it means that we have applied that trajectory the second time. Okay, so now does it mean that this vertical trajectory is non-existent? No, that is not what it meant. That is not. Now this vertical trajectory is being sustained based on the fact that the moment we have free fall right from this classical arbitrary suspension to this quantum arbitrary suspension, then we have, by the virtue of that free fall, we have the power of time to break this quantum arbitrary suspension, and then we have spontaneous symmetry breaking. And you know that whatever you are going to have after the breaking of that symmetry will be accumulation of mass worth. So now here we have compacted equilateral triangle. So we have the trajectory of light and also we have the trajectory of gravity. Don't forget, this trajectory is the trajectory that represents the constancy of light. You can see the label right there. But then this trajectory is the trajectory that represents the constancy of gravity. You can see that. So now we now have this compacted equilateral triangle, and I call this the nucleus. This is going to serve as the nucleus of the future, while the compacted equilateral triangle as we have it here will serve as the nucleus of the past. So now, right inside the nucleus, we know the kind of nuclear system that we have here is known as nuclear fission. Nuclear fission. In this expanding cosmological space, we can actually liken the nuclear system that we have right here, we can liken it to nuclear fusion. So when you have tritium, when you have it merged with deuterium, it will form bigger elements, and that is called helium. By the virtue of it being bigger than what we initially have, that will expand space. Good. But then let us see what we have right here. We know that nuclear fission, we have to accommodate neutron. For instance, if we have a Uranus, I said Uranus. Yes, forgive me. The nucleus of uranium, if we should shoot neutron to that nucleus, we're going to initially have this increase, but because the nucleus is unstable, that will cause the nucleus to split. And so it will split into barium and krypton. So then we have reduction. But initially it was increased. Now, what is actually happening right here is that by the time you substitute this 5.7 times 10 raised to power minus 48 in the formula of everything, then you are going to see that in this nucleus, we have accumulation of mass work towards this edge of energy curvature. But then we realize that the electron is undefined right inside the nucleus. So we only have this, and for that reason, I call that mass accumulation arbitrary mass, because we have this mass accumulation around the electron. You can see that I have an empty circle right here. That represents the electron that is undefined. But then the accumulation of that arbitrary mass worth will be constantly generated. And basically what we have right inside the nucleus is a kind of accelerated momentum, but that momentum is done at a constant speed. So now the additional force, additional energy will be accommodated but contracted, and that will cause, the expansion relative to the contraction of mass decay. So we're going to have that expansion, the mass worth expansion, in the site where we have the constancy of gravitation, and then we have corresponding decaying mechanism at the side of constancy of light. So at the point where the decaying virtue will be equal to that mass accumulation, we're going to have, at the point where they both equal each other, then we're going to have standing wave. That standing wave will project momentum into the higher dimension. It will get connected to the electron of the higher dimension, which will be instantly converted to positron. That positron will then be injected into the substrate dimension. But then at the point where we have the electron being transformed to positron, then we're going to have the electron of the substrate dimension, we're going to have it initiated. And what we have there is known as quantum entanglement. And we know that quantum entanglement can transmit information instantly. So basically, I call the entire system a complex system, because we have this transition from the substrate dimension to the higher dimension. And the kind of feedback that we have, instant feedback that we have, is also being transmitted up to this classical mass worth. And that instant feedback right from the complex system to the classical mass worth, that is what I call objective conscious experience. Objective conscious experience will allow classical mass worth to be aware of its position to where it's supposed to be. And so we cannot have that awareness until we have the connection to the electron of the higher dimension. You understand? Which will be instantly converted to positron, which will then allow the electron of the substrate dimension to be initiated. And then the instant feedback will cause what is known as self-awareness for this classical mass worth. And by being self-aware, this classical mass worth will then know that it is being suspended to this intersection of vertical trajectory, to this point of intersection of vertical trajectory to the horizontal trajectory. And that is where the classical mass worth is supposed to be. But then By having that awareness, then the classical mass what is now aware of where it is relative to where it's supposed to be. But then, once we now have the injection of the positron into the substrate dimension, that is when we're going to have this vertical trajectory being shifted. And that is when we now have that decayed watt of the quantum mass watt, which we have to be 9.109 times 10 raised to power minus 32. Now, the momentum will go towards the singularity of the black hole, and we can use that formula of everything to track the measure of decay at quantum level relative to the measure of decay at classical level. But then we realize that the decay that we have is at the power for quantum mass worth, and that is a reduction of 1. It is constant. We can say that it is constant, but then the decay worth that we have at classical level is not constant. So we usually have this constancy to variation to allow for continuous momentum. So basically, that decay of 1 at the power of quantum mass worth, we actually resort to almost about 2 billion. Close to 2 billion. It will resort to about almost 2 billion watt of mass decay at this classical level. So now, by the time we now use that formula of everything, we're going to reiterate the application by supplying the newly generated quantum mass watt, which is 9.109 times 10 raised to power minus 32 kilogram. We put that in the place of the 2 m's to, get, instead of getting 2 billion, we will now get 2 million, we're going to get 277,750,000 kilograms. That is what we get. So almost about 2 billion is being decayed. But then if we should use that value again, then we will realize that the power will move from minus 32 to 31, and then this base value will be decayed to 1.1. And so we have that 1.1 being suspended right inside the core singularity, or around the core singularity of this black hole. So the signal that we have there is synonymous to this quasar-like signal, the swing forth and back of the quasar-like signal. So we have the power being swung forward and back relative to the base value. So the base value of the electron will swing forth and back, while the power too will swing forth and back. So that is the signal that we have right there. And we know that we cannot move further again, because any further application of the formula of everything will resort to infinite loop. So then the suspension that we have here will relocate this classical mass watt down to this point. It will relocate it to the point of this intersection of vertical trajectory to horizontal trajectory. And then I call that a subjective conscious experience. So subjective conscious experience is just the internalization of that external input to relocate classical mass watt to where it's supposed to be. You understand? So basically, we can see with that we have idea of what consciousness is. But basically, I want to open your eyes to what is actually happening right here. When you look at this, you can see that we have the classical mass worth right inside this system where we have this classical arbitrary suspension. So here we have accumulation of mass worth, but at the quantum level, we only have quantum arbitrary suspension, while the real quantum mass worth is even outside. So even the substrate quantum mass worth is even outside the suspension. So we can see that what we have here is the decaying of mass worth. It is necessary for us to have constantly decaying mechanism that will support that constantly accumulation of mass worth at classical level. So it is like this that we can be sure of constant momentum. And if we're to dissect the time slice, we're going to say that the time slice will be slant, or rather it will be diagonal, because the discrete momentum of energy will be shorter to the continuous flow of time. And so what we have there is sequential, because we have, right from quantum to classical. And so we can say we have cause effect phenomenon. But what do we have right inside the black hole? The effect of classical decaying mechanism comes right from the complex level. And so that we energize momentum, and as a result of that, we're going to have energy to be ahead of time momentum. And so we do not have cause effect kind of phenomenon right inside the black hole. We have effect coming before the cause. It is weird, you understand, but basically that is what we have. But then when it gets to this suspension, time trajectory will then come before the energy for us to have that toggle effect of swing forth and back. But in this cosmological space, what we have is that we have time momentum to be ahead of energy's momentum, and so we have cause effect phenomenon. So in the black hole we have effect cause phenomenon. Just take note of that. So now I'm going to actually drill deeply into the structure of equilateral triangle for us to understand it better. But then before I do that, get to know that at this complex level, now it is not feasible for electron to be instantiated right inside the nucleus because the pressure, the temperature is too much. Don't forget that at higher dimension, we're going to have higher degree of freedom and power. And because of the relativity, then it is feasible for electron to be instantiated right there. And that instantiation will determine, what we're going to have right inside the nucleus of the substrate dimension. But simply because there must be an injection from the higher dimension into the substrate dimension, the electron will be instantly converted to positron, because it is by having positron that we can have a kind of flipped momentum. So what we have right here is known as flipping mechanism, and that is what I call it signature of Almighty God. You understand? So that flipping mechanism is what we even allow the equilateral triangle to be flipped as we have it in the black hole. And so that is the power of formula of everything for you. So now let me show you what is actually going on. Now, to show you what is actually going on, you will see that this equilateral triangle, this is equilateral triangle, but then we have mathematical pattern right here. If you have one at the top, if you have, hierarchical layers, and then at the topmost layer you have only 1. The layer beneath that, you have it to be 1 plus 2. We're just doing normal addition here, but we're doing it layer by layer to give us this pattern, to give us this equilateral pattern. So now you say 1 plus 2, which will give you 3. You move to other layer, you extend it by saying 1 plus 2 plus 3. That will give you 6. You move to the other layer beneath that, you expand it by saying 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. That will give you 10. Now, if you run this down to the baseline, you realize that at the left side, you have constancy of 1. And at the right side, you have variation of 1, 2, 3, 4 to the 0. Now, this is the inherent feature of equilateral triangle. Even though we have symmetric nature of this equilateral triangle, as we have right inside the linear solution that is nested right inside the T, the M, there is this inherent asymmetric nature that we have, which would facilitate continuous momentum. So now, this constancy, if you dissect what I have written here, it says it expands. It says expanding phase by constancy. So the other side is saying contracting phase by variation. So how is this possible? This is the kind of compacted equilateral triangle that we have in the nucleus, just as I showed you earlier. And so what we have there is that we have this contraction towards the edge of that curvature of energy, which we have in form of variation, because time is continuous. The trajectory of time is continuous, while the trajectory of energy is constant. And that is why it is possible for us to have this constancy related to this variation. So now, by being compacted, then the slice of time will be so shrinked, and it will be compacted to align the mass accumulation to the curvature of energy, which will then give us that standing wave. The standing wave that we have is a kind of directionless momentum, which will, sustain that vertical trajectory that we have in that time energy wave model. So now, when you look at this, we can get to know that this side is actually contracting relative to this side of constancy, which is expanding. The side of variation is contracting when you look at this equilateral triangle diagonally. The reason I said this triangle is equilateral is for the fact that when you count this 1, you have it in 10 places. When you count this 1, 2, 3, you see that you have it in 10 places. And when you count this base, you have it in 10 places. And that's why it is equilateral. So now, if we're to dissect this diagonally, you can see that it's actually shrinking towards the right side. So the initial constancy of 1, you have it to be in 10 places. If you count these 2, you have it to be in 9 places. You can see that reduction. If you count these 3 diagonally as it is, you have it in 8 places. If you count this 4 diagonally as it is, you have it in 7 places. If you count this 5 diagonally as it is, you have it. I believe you got the idea. So we average shrink towards this 0. But then, when you try to consider the total numbers as you have it at the extreme right here, you see that we have the alternating of odd number to even number. So now, odd number, we know the formula of odd number is 2n plus 1. By having the odd number formula to be in that format, it's actually pointing to infinity. So if anybody tells you that you can actually get the finite number of natural numbers, probably if you count 1 to 3 to like billion, trillion, you can count it infinitely. Because if anybody tells you that you can have a finite number of the natural number, just ask the person to add one at the back. So the odd number is pointing to infinity, but that odd number, when you dissect the formula, it's actually pointing to suspension. It's pointing to a kind of suspension. So now I'm going to now prove to you that what we have, the suspension that we have at the higher dimension, could be likened to this odd number as we have it. Why the point where we have the alignment of mass accumulation to the curvature of energy could be likened to even number, because when the entire of that symmetric trajectory of time to energy is being exhausted, such as to have that alignment to generate standing wave, we can liken that to even number. So now you can now see that right at the topmost we have odd number, but we have the odd numbers in two places, and that is telling you that we have two singularities. We have the Big Bang singularity, and then we have the black hole singularity. Don't forget that the Schwarzschild solution to general relativity of Albert Einstein generated two singularities. There is one singularity at the central point, and then there is a singularity at the edge. So now, having that two singularities and having these odd numbers being repeated 2 times and the even number being repeated 2 times is an indication of the two singularities. So now we have 1, we have 3, odd number, we have 6, we have 10, even number, we have 15, we have 21, odd number, we have 28, 36, even number, we have 45, and then this 0, 2 will give us 45. So I made it that to be an inverse of this 45 by putting negative in front of it. So now you can see that we have suspension to suspension, and that is telling us that we have infinite kind of phenomenon at the beginning, and so we have infinite phenomenon at the end. But then how can we get to say that we have a finite number? You can get to say you have a finite number by having a kind of formula which will give you 2n minus 1. So the suspension that we have is a mass convergent virtue that can make us to have what is known as finite measure. So now you can see what is happening right inside the equilateral triangle. So we have this kind of suspension right from the outside of the system that we allow for the genuine contact, which we energize momentum further for us to later have a kind of suspension that is higher, you understand, which is same thing as infinity. So basically you can see the way time operates. Time is relative, not absolute, and that is why time we have 2 instances of light measure before light can even be feasible. So anything in time peregrination will be measured 2 times, and that's 2 measures that we have will be inversely related to each other for such measure or for such measurement to be visible. Okay, so now if I should go back, now going back, then you can see that right here, by having genuine contact at higher dimension, right here, it's an indication of even number as we have in that equilateral triangle, because we have genuine contact. And we have that genuine contact because we have mass accumulation, the arbitrary mass accumulation to align with the curvature of energy to have standing wave. In order for us to have this vertical trajectory, now you can see that the vertical trajectory is even beyond the limit of equilateral triangle for us to have the connection to higher dimension. So I call that complex system. So when you have a genuine contact at one side, you must have a kind of infinite phenomenon at the other side. So now by having this classical mass words being suspended to the point of vertical intersection to the horizontal intersection, it's an indication of infinite phenomenon. So that is pointing to the fact that whatever we try to actually hold, or to hold at classical level, we don't actually hold anything until we have that instant feedback of that genuine contact at complex level to the classical level. That is when we can then be aware of what we hold. So the repulsive force will be broken by that instant feedback for us to genuinely hold anything, or to genuinely have any genuine contact with anything at classical level. So basically you can see that right when this classical mass what is being relocated to this intersection, then we can now say that we have the genuine contact. But what do we have inside the black hole singularity? We have suspension. Don't forget I told you that the electron is being decayed, the base value of electron is being decayed to 1.1. But then can we just say that the 0.1 is more or less like a binding force, or binding force, just as we normally have in the nucleus? Because when you add the proton, the neutron, you understand, and the electron of atom, or probably you add all that you have in the nucleus, you see that there is going to be additional value to it, and they call that binding energy. So basically, I don't know what that is, but basically we can actually liken that to the binding energy in the nucleus. So right now you can get to see the facts. So basically, time causes curvature. It is that curvature that actually allows for mass convergence. And because we have the square of time to any instant trajectory of any object in the space, it's actually pointing to curvature that we allow for mass convergence. And so we could have that momentum in spiral formation that will result to repulsive force that will give that heavy sensation of being solid. You understand? So that is the whole thing. So we get to now know the true nature of energy as something that is so flexible that can be transformed either to particle or wave. And then we have the mass worth, the real mass worth, to be a kind of strands that is being spirally formed inversely to the inner energy of what I called, we can call it strands, like spiral formation of strand towards the central point. And we know when you have an action of such, there is going to be a reaction which will be inversely related to that. And that will give us, don't forget, by having it to be in spiral formation, we have angular momentum. Angular momentum will allow for constantly accelerated momentum. And so we're going to have reaction of such. And so it is possible for us to have this repulsive momentum that will give us that sensation of being heavy, to have that feeling of mass worth. But then time, from this we can get to know that time is the electromagnetic speed of relativity scaling. So even the speed of light is not feasible until it is being a multiple of itself, such that one part is inversely related to other. That is when the speed of light is even feasible, and that is the work of time for you. That is the effect of time on light. And by having that, we know that there is going to be a central point which will be initiated, and that is what is called relativity. Because the light can never get to have a genuine contact with the other part. So the initial point can never get genuine contact with the other part, because as this part is approaching the other part, they will be approaching each other at equal speed, and they can only meet at that central point that is being generated by relativity. So now you can see that before we can have genuine contact, we must actually travel at the speed of light. At the speed of time, which is the default speed of time, and it is instant. So now I tell you that time, like I said in the part 2 and the part 1, time has two identities. Time by default is instant. And so you can see the way time is like trying to compress or to contract, the light speed towards the central point to cause that curvature as we have it. You understand? So, but time is in continuous, time is continuous when in relativistic scaling to energy. Then energy, on the other hand, too, has two identities. Energy is discrete when in relativistic scaling to time, but energy is infinite by default. So that is that. Now you have it, and this is going to be the final part. This is the part 3 of the true nature of time, light, and mass as revealed by formula of everything. This is the part 3. This is the final part. So I'm going to put a link to my research publication in the description section of this video. You can click on that to explore the formula of everything. I have 2 publications on peer-reviewed journal. You understand? On peer-reviewed journal. The initial one is titled "The Time Theory of the Universe," while the second one is titled "Seeing the Anatomy of Quantum Gravity Through Formula of Everything." So now I'll put link to my research publication. Then I have a link to a page where you can support me. I am currently working on advanced research on time travel. So in my publication, I briefly talked about time travel, and I shed light on why it is important for particles to travel through the trajectory of energy and not the trajectory of time. But then I'm actually embarking on advanced research on time travel. So people have been supporting me on that page. So the page is Kofi, which is ko-fi.com/. Shotade Olusegun altogether. You can click on that link, then you can support me by donation, and then you can as well join any of my community tiers right there. I'll be uploading some videos that you can never see on any social media, because this formula of everything is so powerful. It's unraveled the entitle of the universe, the mechanics of the universe, and so there are some hidden secrets to even wealth. So I'm going to be sharing some videos which will benefit those that will join my tiers right there. You can as well join the tiers, and then by the time I start uploading those videos, you can, benefit from it. So thank you very much for your time. This is where I'm going to call it a day. God bless you. Remain blessed forever.